And just as we're getting ready, I'll just ask that Joe Wild and Kim Barrett on behalf of the Rights Policy Workshop, Teja Madher for the Fiscal Relations Workshop. I think it's going to be Jody for the specific claims one, and then Jody Woods, I think, and then Jamie Holmes for the youth discussion group. And just in terms of framing that discussion, we're going to begin that discussion by having the regional chief, TG, sort of set a context for that discussion, and then following the presentations, we'll look to Cookby Judy Wilson to conclude that session for us. So we're just a few minutes away from beginning, and once again, I want to invite the delegation back in from the foyer area, and we'll ask that the staff begin closing those doors as a clear signal that we look to get started. Yep, I got it. Yeah, and just a correction in terms of the order of speakers. So we will listen and hear from Joe Wild, then Fiscal Relations, which is Teja Madher, and then Specific Claims, it's going to be Natalie Neville, who was in that workshop, not the others that participated in that. And then, of course, Jamie Holmes for the youth. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll ask that you begin wrapping up your conversations, and please join with me in welcoming back to the podium the Regional Chief, TG.
Thank you, Harold. Just real quickly, I just want to acknowledge all of you that are here today, and also the staff from Indigenous Services Canada and CERNA, and my two sister organizations, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the First Nations Summit, for coming together and bringing this all together to talk about these very important matters. And it has been a very important year in terms of the commitments we're seeing from the federal government. And for BC, we're quite unique because we also have the provincial government at the table. And as we stated as the theme of this joint gathering is self-determination. And what I heard today in the examples that the panels that we brought together was the great examples of those First Nations utilizing their self-determination to create that space for themselves, to make sure that their children are safe. And it's quite important that not only that we have those institutions that we create on our own, but also the legislation that's needed federally and provincially. You know, we talk about pipelines, and there's one really important one that must stop, is that pipeline of our children who are in care that go directly to be incarcerated. As a BCA FIN, I have three portfolios. I have fisheries, justice, and economic development. And a lot of the discussions we talked about in justice is the utilization of the RCMP and also the issue of child welfare and how that's connected. And one of the speakers today talked about that, you know, the history of the residential school process of church, police, and state taking our children away. Then the 60s scoop. So all this needs to be undone, and this is really where we're trying to create that relationship and trying to create policies to make change in our communities. The discussions that was in here in this room to talk about pathways to self-determination and recognition of rights. Good discussions. We talked about the issues of the treaty process was brought up. And I recall that my community 12 years ago left the treaty process in regards to the issues of accessing loans, the mandates not changing. And that was one of the reasons that I hear time and time again of why our communities are leaving the modern treaty process. So that perhaps needs to change. There's different arrangements now that are being created in the province of British Columbia. We've seen the Chilcotin court case, you know, the Honeycutin, the area, the Brittany Triangle, recognized as being title. So if no other First Nations have title in that area, what does that mean about the laws of that land? Well, there was laws there before colonization. There was indigenous laws there. So that needs to be recognized. And that's really what the position that we're coming from as part of the framework. So, you know, the issues have been long-standing. We do have the political commitment federally and provincially. And as Doug White said, time is up. We can't continue to go to the courts. We can't continue to be arrested to protect our rights and our title and our interests. And I think moving ahead, it's really our responsibility as well as Indigenous people. Many years ago, when we were talking about the very controversial liquefied natural gas project that has been brought up time and again with the Wet'suwet'en and the Coastal Gas Link, my tribal council, as the tribal chief, we brought together all these people and all these nations, including the ambassador of Japan to Prince George, and talk about the issues of liquefied natural gas. And one of the first chiefs that spoke up was the late Justa Monk. And we lost him last year, or it's been over a year, I believe. And one of the things that he stated was that, you know, we have to reconcile amongst ourselves. And what he was talking about was those arrangements that we need to have to deal with this so-called overlap or shared territories. So that's our responsibility. So as I leave today and I head back north to the Natural Resources Forum, much of what I say here will be stated to those third parties, those companies that want to continue to extract without consent, and those companies that need to come to us and ask for permission. And we continue to push forward our rights and our title and our interests, but I think also it's our responsibility to keep this government accountable. You know, 3 years ago, over 3 years ago, what did Prime Minister Trudeau state to not only this room, but to Indigenous people across Canada? The most important relationship to his government were Indigenous people. And it's tough to realize where we're at right now with this relationship when we see RCMP out there breaking up roadblocks. We see the demotion of one of our top political officials. And we see the shuffle where we had a great relationship and trust with Minister Philpott. And there's going to be a great expectation to the minister who is going to be here tomorrow, Minister Carolyn Bennett, and the new minister for Indigenous Services Canada, Seamus O'Regan, will be here. And there's going to be huge expectation from him, not only from Canada, but from this room, because I certainly do have great expectations for what he's going to try to really step into, because of the relationship we had with Minister Philpott. So I thank her. I thank Minister Philpott when this ministry was separated and it was supposed to be a devolution. We had much skepticism. But she built up that trust, not only here, but across Canada. So there's big shoes to fill for Minister Reagan. So I thank you for listening to a few thoughts that I have just looking at the discussion today. I do have to leave right away, and I thank you, and I thank the Coast Salish people for being wonderful hosts, for allowing us in their territory. So, Masai Cho.
Thank you very much, Regional Chief, for your not only your reflections on the day and our current context, but also in terms of some departing remarks. I appreciate that. Let's turn back to the discussion we had today in this room on the rights policy. And so I'll ask you to welcome Joe Wild, the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of Treaties and Aboriginal Government with the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. So please welcome Joe.
Government title is always a mouthful. So I'm just going to give a quick summary of the discussion that we had in the two breakout sessions this afternoon on the new policy. So some themes emerged, I think, out of the dialogue with participants, and I want to thank everybody that came and participated in either one of the sessions. It's a rich dialogue. It is just the beginning of the work that we need to do, I know, but I do want to acknowledge and thank everybody that had an opportunity to provide some views and some comments. So some of the main themes that emerged were around things like Canada should not be dictating a nation or a collective. We need to enable and facilitate Indigenous peoples doing this work themselves. We need to make sure that whatever we come up with in terms of a new policy needs to speak to the implementation of free, prior, and informed consent, but it needs to do so in a way that also reflects Indigenous perspectives in various situations. We need to address the impact of forced amalgamation, including before the Indian Act was enacted, and that we need to address the lack of recognition and the challenge in terms of how to address the interests of communities and needs. A lot of participants raised issues around overlap, boundary disputes, shared territories, the different phrases. I don't even think we've got adequate language yet to properly describe this. Lots of participants made the point that the policies of both British Columbia and Canada have been making the situation worse, have driven a more extensive overlapping claims issue than perhaps there otherwise would be, and that the approach of government of just kind of then standing back and saying, oh, it's for you to resolve is not really a satisfactory approach. That we need to work together to develop mechanisms to support the resolution of these issues. Canada and British Columbia do need to play a role in supporting this work, not putting ourselves into a position, obviously, of being an arbiter, but we need to do what's necessary in order to provide both resources, but also space, mechanisms, processes in order for Indigenous peoples to be able to have these dialogues to address these issues. I think a couple of strong points also came out around we've got to start walking the talk. There's not enough of that. I think that's probably true. Also, that it's not being felt. Some of the talk, particularly coming from me, isn't necessarily being felt at all the tables and isn't being felt around particular issues from various departments, including DFO, Coast Guard, Transport Canada. And I think we've acknowledged that, yeah, we still have more work to do around that. And a number of people raised kind of specific circumstances and their specific communities to highlight the issues around the unevenness in approach that we still need to address. There were questions raised about, when is the forgiveness of loans going to come? And I'll just reiterate for everybody that it's tied to a budget decision, so we're waiting for that decision. And once we get that decision, then hopefully we'll be able to move forward pretty quickly. And then there was also some issues, raised around where are we in terms of reflecting current case law, and are we going to be able to have a policy approach that does that? And I think in response to that, simply noted that a lot of the work at the tables reflects that. A lot of tables exist because of those First Nations having brought litigation forward, but we need to be able to move beyond the idea that it's just for the courts to spur us into action as governments, that we need to be more proactive in being responsive to the kinds of issues that are being raised at tables across the country. And hopefully we will get to a space where litigation is, not the only mechanism available for Indigenous peoples in order to spur government into action. Hopefully we'll be able to get to a point where we've rebuilt the relationship sufficiently that we in government are being much more responsive than we have been. I think those are kind of the main highlights that I wanted to raise coming out of the discussion. There was lots more, and I can't do it full justice in the time that I've got, but just to reiterate, it's the start of a dialogue on replacing these policies, and we're committed to having significant engagement around this, and we're committed to working within the processes and structures that exist here in British Columbia in order to have those discussions with you. So this is kind of the beginning of the beginning, and I look forward to seeing many of you over the course of the next few weeks and months as we roll up our sleeves to do the hard work. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wild. Appreciate that. We will turn our attention to the other workshop that happened before the afternoon break, which was the new fiscal relationship, collaborative fiscal policy for self-government. While that is connected to the broader new fiscal relationship development, it is specific work that's being done with the coalition of groups that have more recent negotiated agreements. And so please help me welcome from the Tawasin First Nation, Teja Madher, to make the presentation. And just as she's making her way here, I will note that tomorrow, immediately following lunch, we do have a presentation on the broader fiscal relations discussion in the 10-year grants, which we've been hearing about as well. So please welcome Teja.
Thanks very much. I'm not speaking from any notes here, so forgive me if I sort of not totally collected my thoughts. So our breakout session was on the collaborative fiscal policy development process. So I think people like to hear about this for two reasons. One, they're interested in collaboration. What does sort of co-development look like? And then also, what are the elements of a new fiscal relationship? So I'll just give a little background on both of those things and then maybe get into some of the discussion. So as was mentioned, the collaborative fiscal policy development process that we were talking about in our breakout session was one with self-governing Indigenous governments, so SGIG, sometimes an acronym you might hear, and so it's mostly modern treaty nations, but also those with standalone self-government agreements. And it's been a very involved process over the last couple of years. There have been mostly technical representatives from self-governing Indigenous governments who come and engage regularly with federal officials on the development of a policy that will guide Canada's negotiators at individual sort of fiscal renewal tables. So it's really an opportunity to make kind of transformative change. And the model is based on expenditure need. So we took the experience of these self-governing Indigenous governments. So I work for Tawasin, so been implementing self-government for the last 10 years, but also working with Yukon nations, others from across the country on what is it actually like to implement self-government. So the work involved, I think, with federal officials has involved a lot of building trust. I think building effective working relationships. We had some very difficult conversations at that table, but the most important element was that we were able to build relationships that could withstand conflict. So, and there has been a fair bit of that. So, for example, in the area of benchmarking, I think this idea of like what does a nation with a self-government agreement do? What is it like? We're unique, sort of new orders of government. So to be able to talk about our lawmaking authorities and the kind of creative problem solving we want to do, that's sort of grounded in culture and language and heritage, I think was a learning process for the federal government to try to kind of get their head around and to be able to find appropriate benchmarks. So sometimes, looking at what is it actually going to take to enact a law in this area, and what kind of expertise will you need, and if we're costing that based on functions, like what would somebody in the provincial government who was working on that, what would they make, and how can we sort of how can we build a model that's actually grounded in truth and in experience? So we at the breakout, we spoke about some kind of key points along our timeline. So coming up together with principles, and then a report on progress made, and then eventually a policy, sort of a policy framework, which was like co-developed in the true sense of the word. Kind of, you have 30 people sitting in a room, like a big screen. People are making comments around specific language edits. So it takes a lot of work to be able to get to that point. And so that was a sort of key success. And now there's a lot of hard work ahead too in building out annexes sort of focused on expenditure need. Questions in that breakout involved some of the impact on the work on negotiating nations. So everybody who's participated in the process is a signatory already. So how can involvement in that process kind of further involve negotiating nations? And we also talked about what are some real on the ground changes. So we have, Tsawwassen currently in a fiscal renewal. Whatever happens at this collaborative policy table will directly impact our next round of renewal, and that's the same scenario for other self-governing Indigenous governments, but we have yet to see those changes actually on the ground. So I think everybody who's part of that process is always happy to answer questions. It's I think on the federal side and on the self-government side, it's been seen as I think a model that should be replicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teja. So let us turn to the specific claims discussion, which was an update on the claims negotiations in BC and an overview of activities of the BC Specific Claims Working Group. And we'll invite Natalie Neville, who is the Senior Director of Negotiations in the Specific Claims Branch, and who, of course, participated in that workshop, to provide the recap. Please help me welcome Natalie.
Okay, it was a very interesting session, I must say. Wasn't quite sure what to expect, as this was my first joint gathering, but I think it was very interesting. One of the themes, I guess, that came out was certainly around funding. So funding for research, funding for tribunal, funding for First Nations to be involved in the claims process, and funding generally to properly resource the branch, in fact, to address the settlement of claims. Another very strong theme, of course, was the desire for an impartial process, so an independent mechanism to assess and evaluate claims, where Canada has, and as we know historically, that Canada has been too partial, I guess, in its involvement in the claims process. There was an outline of some of the work of the BC Specific Claims Working Group, and some of the important work that they're doing around that and their liaison with communities and so on. In the sort of Q&A session, two main themes came out, I guess: the time required to process claims, which is too long, and I guess a discussion of individual claims. So there were a number of chiefs or representatives from First Nations communities who kind of asked about their own claim and where they were at and so on. So I would direct anyone who has claims or questions about their own claims to perhaps visit us at the booth. We have a booth number 7 out there, but it also gives us an idea that what we regard perhaps as more open or transparent or a better functioning process is not necessarily the case. And so I think a lot of First Nations sometimes feel that their claim has gone into a bit of a black hole and that they don't necessarily have a good sense of where things are at. So again, I opened, as I said at the session this afternoon, I invite anyone and everyone who has a question to either contact our senior portfolio manager here in the region, myself, the DG, whoever it might be. We're happy to have those discussions and to let First Nations know where their claim is at or what issues may be coming up. So I think that probably summarizes our session. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, much appreciated. So let us turn to the youth session which took place, and one of the youth participants has volunteered to make that presentation. So please help me welcome Jamie Holmes. Although as I'm looking at her, I'm not positive she volunteered.
Thank you. Ooh, there's a lot of people. Howdy. I'm not great at public speaking, so just bear with me on this. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations for allowing us to do this great work here today. I'm going to go off my notes, and they're a little messy. So, the main question that we got offered to discuss in the youth forum was what we want to convey to the rest of you as youth. And I want to thank all the youth for actually coming and showing up and being able to discuss this important stuff. The main message we want to convey to the rest of you is the number of youth that actually show up. I forget the number, but when you look at this room right now, like I can see all of you, there's a lot of you with very little youth, I guess you could say. There's only about 10 max youth that actually came in the discussion. And I don't know, I just wanted to convey that. I'm so nervous, oh my God. Okay, next. This is a lack of communication when we don't have youth that actually show up to these conferences. I've been to a lot of these conferences, and I just want to say that still there's not that much of a change. And this can be because of the lack of communication between chief and council and the rest of youth itself. Oh, God. Okay. What are the solutions? So a lot of the solutions that we came up with as youth were incentives and leadership programs. Being here, this is what I want to say, being here is another way of traditional learning. Back in the day, we didn't have computer and technology. We were there, we were learning, we were watching our aunties and uncles and moms and dads cut fish, we were watching them skin moose. That is how we learn, when we have physical bodies being there and watching and communicating. We need that also as leaders. Our leaders, thank you to my wonderful community, Nakazli Watan, to allowing me to come to all these meetings, because I want to be that leader. I want to be this leader of tomorrow that we always talk about. And when you have physical bodies like me and the rest of the youth here, we actually engage in that process of becoming the leaders of tomorrow that you all see in us. Another solution was being able to have a youth council. Wonderful Dallas over here from Shuswap talked about how the communication with his youth was very on point, I guess you could say, because of their youth council itself. So that was one of our other solutions to being here and being able to communicate better. And again, that goes back to traditional ways of learning. Another message that we wanted to convey, and that was highly advocated by Dallas as well, was more, and I guess a more extreme way of implementing language and culture. A lot of us talked about how our culture is also our identity. Our language is how we identify of ourselves. When we see big things such as suicide rate, it's because we don't see, like, we aren't able to connect with our culture and we aren't able to connect with our language. And that was a really big thing we wanted to advocate, was being able to practice our language and being able to practice our culture, because that's what we have and that's what we want. finally, I guess our message we want to convey was inspiring more youth. I know for my communities and a lot of your other communities, you have a lot of leaders that want to be leaders. You guys have them. You just have to get that communication. Being able to communicate that, capture it, get youth here, and respect all the things that they say and do, and how we as youth will demand that responsibility with follow-ups. We can be here, we will be here, and we will answer all the questions, but we want to demand that responsibility. Where's your accountability when we ask for a follow-up? What is actually being done when we demand more language and culture in our communities? We want to see that follow-up. We don't want to see your talk and talk and talk. We want to see our actual younger nephews and nieces being able to speak our language. And always matching problems with solutions, I think, was a very big one. We talk about a lot of problems we have in our communities, but let's match those problems that we have with the solutions. And another last one, I guess, was if you're a youth and you missed today's discussions, be sure to show up tomorrow for our dinner with Honorable Bennett. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but that seemed like leadership skills to me. So, congratulations. So, as noted, we'll turn to Cookby Judy Wilson to provide some final contextual remarks before we transition to our next activity. Please help me welcome her back to the podium.
Thank you. I can imagine you're very tired after a long day, but I think with the different sessions, it's really critical that we get that clarity in the communications. And one of the things I just wanted to say quickly to Natalie for our session on specific claims is we actually talked about the mischaracterization of these policy changes as collaboration, and how both are untrue and completely conflicts with Canada's impoverished and starving out the processes with the tribunal and the claims. So I didn't want to miss that because many of the questions and the speakers talked about that, including myself, because you can't have Canada with a great conflict of interest trying to resolve these claims. You need that independent process. It has to be underscored. We've had documents and decades of this. I think Chief Byron Lewis spoke to it even being in the British North American Act, where they had a committee that dealt with that independent claims process. So we've been talking about it for many, many years. And the delegates asked about a policy for large value claims. I didn't want to miss that, Chief Byron, because I get back to Interior, I'll hear from it. We actually have an Escondido Douglas claim that's a large value claim as well, which was promised in a political agreement with the AFN and the federal government, but it hasn't come together. Natalie explained that it's stuck in the process yet. It hasn't been active at all, really. So the large value claims are in limbo, and in our case, in Escondido, it was rejected twice. I also wanted to say that the delegates also asked about more information about the new risk-based approach. I think it was Chief Lee Spahan, if you're here still, he asked that. It was a really good question. Both Mark and I were talking about that, and that's a bang-on question. The risk-based approach to claims negotiation, asked if First Nations were informed or if we're involved in developing that first. We were not informed, obviously, or involved, so we need more information on this risk-based approach. And if you're in any negotiation, usually your risk-based approach is for your own interests, right? So I'd like to see how this is going to be developed if Canada's in conflict of interest and they're developing a risk-based approach. So that's some of the questions I wanted to add. And I was hearing also, I wanted to mention a bit about the the session on the S3 Indian status workshop. I was really appalled, I have to say. How many attended that workshop on S100? I know our Grand Chief was there, and Chief Lee Spahan, and their questions were dismissed. I have to say, we're here as, to ask these questions, and to have an outright denial that there is sex-based discrimination in the Indian Act by your register. Somebody here has got to address that. somebody here from the department, because when you have your registrar, one of the people that are working for your government saying their outright denial that there is sex discrimination in the Indian Act, and the UN body, the UN decision just said, yes, there is. Does she know more than the UN body? You know, I just want to say, you know, that's completely contradictory for the decision of the UN Human Rights Commission and our advice from the lawyers that, you know, we talked to. So again, here's a classic example of that communications, you know, the right hand and the left hand doing whatever. And still yet Canada has to come to say, you know, how they're going to implement, you know, that UN decision. This is one of the highest human rights bodies, you know, so it's not, oh, we might listen to it, oh, it's an inspirational thing. No, Canada, you have to do this. You have to implement that fully. And I think we had a communique that spoke to that, that was sent out today, and for this to be happening at our panel today, after we're talking about, you know, how we're going to change our path forward and what we're going to do better and we're going to communicate better, well, we better all be on the same page. You have to let that register know that there's no ifs and buts about this. There is actual sex discrimination. It was founded by one of the top bodies in the world, the UN, you know, Commission, and you know we have to see about the money. Instead of going to the survey, we should be saying, well, how are we going to implement this? Not denying it exists. My God, that was like dealt with already. Let's get on with the next steps here. So I have to raise that to the attention over here. I don't know if it's Joe or, you know, who, Minister Bennett. Somebody has to deal with that. And I want an apology for our Grand Chief, and I want an apology for Chief Lee Spahan with the way they were dismissed in that session. That shouldn't be happening that way. You know, and plus, you know, we want to make sure when we're heard here at these sessions that it's recorded, but I also said in some of the sessions, give back that information so we could verify that's what was said, and then we can start moving on to how we're going to make these changes in these different areas and workshops. I know there's a lot that we're dealing with in these sessions, and some of the new ones that are here, you know, it's a lot of stuff going on at the same time, but we are, and some people say that when they come to these big meetings and that they say, well, I'm so confused, I don't know what's happening. But I always say to the new chiefs, or I always say to some of the ones new to the table, you cannot be confused if you know who you are. If you have your, you know your Indigenous nation, your region you're from, your language, your culture, where you're from, you can't be confused with all this bureaucratic stuff that goes on all the time, or this different, policy changes and stuff that happen all the time. Your nation has your Indigenous sovereignty and your Indigenous laws and rights and jurisdiction. Never let that go. And we can see that happening with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, and they're leading the way for a lot of us and saying, you know, that's how we make decisions on our land. It's not the federal government or, you know, provincial government coming on our land and telling us what to do and, you know, how things are going to work. I really applaud those chiefs for standing up, and we need to continue to support them. And I also applaud the work you're doing at the table, because I really hear of some of those real good questions from the chiefs and those really good articulate thinking, as always, raising those issues to this level. So I just wanted to say, Cook's Jam, and thank you. And sounds like tomorrow we're going to have another day, round 2, I guess, making sure we get our questions across and get them answered. But I really want an apology for our Grand Chief and Chief Lee Spahan, the way they were treated in that workshop. Cook's Jam.
Yalakisa Cookpee Wilson, and to the other speakers on our Heard and Observed panel for helping us reflect on what we've talked about, what we've seen, what we've heard today, some transgressions, but also some exciting things, which I'm sure will be the case over the next couple of days with a gathering this large. So as has been mentioned, thank you so much for being here, to the end of the day. I have just a couple of housekeeping announcements to make before we adjourn day 1. So tomorrow, day 2, our theme is moving towards self-determination, building capacity through partnerships. And we're very honored that tomorrow morning we'll be joined by National Chief Perry Bellegarde, starting precisely at 8:45. We, of course, our speakers tomorrow morning have very tight schedules, and so we need to be very conscious of the timelines in the morning. After the National Chief, we are excited to welcome Honourable Minister Carolyn Bennett to the stage, and then our new Honourable Minister O'Regan, speaking on behalf of Indigenous Services Canada. So as was mentioned this morning, 10 days into his portfolio, this will be a wonderful opportunity to get to meet the new minister, and it's pretty early for him to be taking questions, and so more what we're looking for in that session. He's indicated that he would really love to hear from folks in the room about some of the key priorities that you'd like to identify. And he will, of course, be taking feedback from all of the other sessions. And so that's really a listening opportunity, a chance for you to see his face and get to know our new minister and hopefully build some of that trust that Minister Philpott had built with us. And then, of course, breakout sessions and plenaries tomorrow afternoon, as well as a fairly full agenda for the youth. I want to remind youth delegates, or those of you that brought youth delegates, that they have a breakfast meet and greet with Chief Clarence Louie, which begins at 7:30 a.m. in the Mackenzie Room. And so if you have youth who are not here right now, maybe just remind them about that opportunity starting at 7:30 tomorrow morning. And then, of course, as our lovely youth speaker earlier mentioned, youth delegates also have an opportunity to meet with Honourable Minister Bennett at 5:30 and share some of their notes from today's session, and really it's an open floor for them to identify their priorities. So I think that's a wonderful opportunity. Really grateful to the youth for putting their names forward to take part in that session. And again, if you have youth who have come with you to the conference that are not here today, please advise them of that opportunity, and they're welcome to join in at that 5:30 time slot in the Mackenzie Room as well. So that's kind of what our day looks like tomorrow. Of course, in a moment when I adjourn here, we have a networking power time. That's a way to get us hyped up. Networking power time upstairs with senior federal officials and, of course, your colleagues in the room. And so we'll invite you to come on up to the Stanley Park foyer on the second floor for that sort of reception. We also have two groups who will be sharing their cultural performance with us as part of that reception. But really, that's a time for you to mingle, maybe follow up with folks in the room, and enjoy yourselves. And then after that, we just hope that you have a restful evening and come bright and early for 7:30 a.m. tomorrow buffet breakfast before we kickstart our day 2 agenda. Do we have a prize draw? Is that happening right now? Okay, so I'm gonna ask Harold to lead us into this final prize draw.
Draw 2 names, and there's for these book bags.
Okay, so it's from UBCIC. We have 2 briefcases. It looks like they're full of goodies, so I'm just going to quickly pull 2 names.
Louis breakfast is on Thursday, not tomorrow.
Oh, I'm sorry. The Chief Louis breakfast is on Thursday, not tomorrow. Okay, so just Minister Bennett tomorrow. So our first winner for the book bag is Cynthia Dick from Tishat. Cynthia? Cynthia in the room? Must be in the room to win. Too bad, Cynthia.
Going once, going twice, gone.
We have Crystal Hatzidemetrio from Spuzum. Crystal H from Spuzum. Okay. We'll throw their names back in case they get another chance tomorrow. Allison Green. Is Allison Green in the room? Your odds are looking pretty good. How about Dean Nelson from Lilwat? Dean Nelson? Now you get to rat out all your colleagues and their names get called and they don't stand up. We have Shane Modine from Lake Babine. Shane Modine. Sorry if I'm pronouncing any of these wrong. Carrying quickly on, Corrine Hunt from Quaggut. Is Corrine in the room?
Yeah, she moved. The new counselor.
I know, there's lots of folks in the foyer. Oh, well, this is how it works. They'll all be in here tomorrow. Tracy McClellan from ESDC. Tracy McClellan. Congratulations. Let's put our hands together for Tracy. We've got one more prize to give out.
Back of the room.
She's right in the back. Maybe Tracy, just raise your hand so Jennifer can bring you your prize. Priscilla Mueller. Priscilla? Oh, great. Perfect. So if you two ladies can just raise your hands, and we'll bring the prizes to you. Right on. So could we just take one more moment to put our hands together for all of the folks who spoke on panels or in breakout sessions or played another important leadership role today? Let's put our hands together for all of our speakers today one more time. Thus concludes day one. Please have a lovely evening, and we'll see you either upstairs at Power Hour with the senior officials or tomorrow morning for breakfast.